After having examined the historical context of the slogan, "The personal is political," let us explore some of its interpretations and impact so as to identify some ways in which we can learn from them. Before we begin, I have a question to ask you. Do you believe that you are all able to practice your politics at all times in all environments and amongst all your peers in the same way? Do you feel more comfortable voicing your opinion in some settings rather than in others? In the 1970s, after the slogan's popularization, personal practices were heavily scrutinized as performances of traditionally oppressive masculinity and femininity. Personal choices were considered reflections of one's political attitude, that is, the personal also had to be in line with the political. Paula Rust contended that one should make personal choices that are consistent with one's personal politics. Personal life and personal politics are indistinguishable. In practice, such an argument often leads to dissonance between one's politics and the reality of one's safety, particularly when the practice of some choices may expose individuals and communities to physical, emotional, and other forms of harm. It is essential to remember that those who align themselves with feminist movements are also products of deep social conditioning and engage in continuously balancing the process of unlearning harmful behaviors and mindsets, examining learned behaviors, and critically reflecting on their politics and lived realities. For example, several feminists are conflicted as to whether they are bad feminists for conforming to certain patriarchal norms to make their survival easier for themselves within communities, families, etc. Even those that may have inherent power imbalance present. For example, suppose you belong to a persecuted minority in an area with heavy armed conflict. In that case, you may choose not to participate in rallies that may expose you to physical harm. Would this choice mean that you do not believe in the rights of your community, hope for peace, or that you cannot continue your activism in other ways? Some feminists also find that conforming to some social norms allows them to leverage their position as an insider in these communities to initiate potentially transformative conversations and action. In some instances, thus, the political principle might be compromised or reinterpreted in the light of personal considerations. In her essay, Hanisch also briefly touches upon how women have mastered shuffling techniques, conforming to the social expectations perhaps as a defense mechanism. Have you ever made such a choice, or do you find yourself reflecting on one right now? Conversely, it may be argued that for sustaining feminism, one must unequivocally critique the sexist practices that may unfold. However, skeptics argue that the complete politicization of personal life is a characteristic of totalitarianism. This argument is fallacious and presents a negligence of feminist politicization. Feminist politicization is a struggle for equal social power, which is reflected positively both in intimate social relationships and institutions. Hanisch also devotes some time to the discussion of the apolitical woman. She adds that feminist action must constantly be reevaluated to make it more accessible and inclusive, a crucial tenet of present social justice practice. The idea that feminists must not be complacent has trickled down into the ever evolving ideology. Hanisch considers apoliticism as a valid political stance and invites feminists to inquire into our ways of doing action to understand why apolitical women may not want to participate. She shifts the onus onto the feminists to strengthen their position. What are your thoughts on apolitical stances? Why do you think people make the choice to remain apolitical, and how would you respond to this choice? I'm going to give you some more time to just think about that. The argument of the personal is political was also central to prefigurative politics, the strategies activists applied to design a different world than the present one by deconstructing the status quo. Audre Lorde, in her essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, insisted on affirmative action for inclusion so that feminist movement may survive. Lord spends adequate time elaborating on the term difference when she believes transforms one's relationship with the world and subsequently forms lived experiences. Personal power derives from these differences. The title of the essay reflects how attempting to alter the patriarchal status quo using the tools of patriarchy is a redundant loop. She encourages self reflection to reveal the differences which define the personal and political. In the essay, she contests that any feminist discourse that does not acknowledge and account for intersectional lived experience is incomplete, a mere shadow of the necessary discourse, which only weakens feminist discussion of the personal and political. Much like Hanisht, she stresses on the significance of the community for putting any permanent change into action. By community, Lord refers to a space where individual differences can coexist, so that difference is no longer at the root of separatism. Even within the community of feminists, inclusive spaces must be consciously created. It is important to note here that inclusion cannot be uniformly defined for all members of the group since they might have unique needs. The perceived difference creates social categories and feeds into the us versus them technique of othering, which is sustained through politics in the media. Who the other is also determined by the demographics of a region. The same tools of oppression discussed earlier deepen this cleavage by fueling anxiety and fear against the other. As John Powell wrote regarding the emboldened rage and violence against the other, belonging was presented as the antonym to othering. Until social categories existed, acknowledging sameness would not be possible due to the existence of related phenomenon of the normative. In the essay, Lord also analyzes how pitting women against each other is convenient for maintaining the social power imbalance and where the small act of forming real connections with each other becomes transgressive. And the desire to nurture each other is not pathological but redemptive. So, as we go on to politicizing our own personal experiences, attitudes, and behaviors, we can draw a few key lessons from the discourse surrounding the slogan, more than 50 years after its popularization. First, it is crucial to learn about the movements that have come before us and those who work alongside us to identify and critically examine that within our own lived experiences, which is social and systemic. Second, while it is true that the work of challenging harmful learned behaviors and attitudes within communities and even in institutions at large is difficult and may sometimes expose us to physical, psychological, or other forms of harm, it is important to identify when a situation may escalate and pose a strong safety risk and manage it accordingly. Third, in order to sustain our movements and personal politics, it is useful and necessary to remain reflexive, flexible, and willing to learn about our own understanding of the world and the context and the actors we are surrounded by. Finally, it is critical for us as we develop our personal social justice based politics to incorporate an intersectional lens and focus on creating restorative spaces of community care and inclusion in order to understand and honor the unique needs and contexts of our communities. What are some lessons you can think of towards politicizing your own personal world? I hope that this lecture helped you better reflect on your personal political priorities and practices and pushed you to engage with them critically. In the next module, we will be learning about ways to action our politics towards anti oppressive social justice objectives.